Hello, Kirk. How are you today?
I'm doing well, Sheldon. How about yourself?
Doing pretty good. It's good to be back in the saddle, otherwise known as my office chair, after some time away. And yeah, yeah, looking forward to a little bit of structure in my life again.
Yeah, like I find the summertime, there's so many other activities and you just get chaotic. And then I always look forward to September. It's kind of like the smoothing out of all the ripples.
Now, to be fair, getting up and it's already sort of dark outside and the weather isn't immediately shorts weather. I do like the summer in that there's a little bit more heat and light, but
Yeah, I like the summer. I'd have to confess I do, but I also kind of like all the seasons. I have fun things I do all year round. So I know it's a bit of a sad note to part with summer, but then the fall activities start up and the winter ones. And
maybe for me the problem is that I don't like all four seasons in equal amounts.
that's true. Like winter
So
could be shortened a bit.
like 2 weeks of winter, totally fine. Spring, good full 2 months would be fine. 6 months of summer maybe, and then a little bit of fall, but yeah,
Oh, I'd like a long fall,
long
long one.
fall.
I'd like one that's probably at least a month longer with all the leaves still on the trees turning colors. That's to me probably my favorite time of year when the leaves are just aflame with color. But that only lasts for a few weeks and they start falling off. So,
That's one of the things I like about the prairies and Ontario and stuff is you get the more the leaves
yeah,
rather than like the quills and the pines and different
yeah,
things like that. Because
yeah.
in BC you just don't have that droppage of
No,
leaf as much.
yeah, that's true.
So what else has gone on in your life in the last little bit? I saw on Facebook your wife was making peppers, pickled peppers.
Oh, yeah. Well, she actually canned a pile of stuff, but my favorite that she made was originally was 14. I called them the 14 jars of the apocalypse. And the reason is because they're pickled peppers, but they're not just any pickled peppers. Here's a little list I made. So here's what's in those jars of the apocalypse: habanero peppers, cherry bombs, Portugal hots, hot cinnamons, chili peppers, and jalapenos. There's a few sweet peppers in there just to moderate it a bit. So these are so hot. I just love it. They like you put a bite in your mouth. Basically, and I might be exaggerating slightly here, I suggested that there's enough energy in just one of her jars of the apocalypse to power a large city for a year. Gives you a
Maybe
nice
send some to California. I heard they need a little energy right now.
yes, they really do. So when you pop a morsel into your mouth, if you're not used to this, the first thing that happens is your eyes literally bulge out in terror, and when you realize what you've done, but it's too late, and then you have to scream, but you can't because that enormous amount of energy being released in a matter of seconds has turned your face into superheated plasma, so you can't even scream. You just have to endure it. And I find that it goes good with pastas, meatloaf, tuna melts, not tuna melts, cream tuna and salmon, those sorts of things.
Wow. Well, I might have to make a trip out there to experience the apocalypse a little bit with you. All right, I'll add it to my agenda. So today we got a bit of a hard deadline. So what we'll do is we're going to talk about biblical interpretation. So this comes out of a comment that was left on your God and Slavery video, I believe, by Corey I. And
Yeah, he
so
raised quite a few good questions.
it was a great conversation you
Yeah,
were having. I was enjoying watching that.
yeah.
So let me just
Should
pull
get
it
him on the
up
show
here.
here sometime. I don't know. I don't know him whether he'd be willing to do that, but he definitely takes the skeptic side of the equation. And
Now, was he formerly a Christian? Did he say was he a?
oh, I can't recall, but I think he might have been some form of Christian beforehand because I think, if I recall, he had a pretty decent knowledge of the Bible, like a better than average knowledge of the Bible. And so his comment.
So we're going to jump into the conversation literally halfway through one of his messages, but we're not dealing with what that conversation was about as much as we want to talk about the statement he makes here. So for the sake of the argument, let's say your interpretation is correct and the Calvinist understanding is incorrect and perhaps even blasphemous. Wouldn't you admit that it's a huge issue that the Bible is so easy to misunderstand and misinterpret? I find it hard to believe that God would give humanity such a contradictory and confusing text to base faith off of, especially when understanding the Bible is so important for one's faith, which is a determinant of salvation or damnation. Great comment. This is a very, very, very good comment. Thank you, Corey. Love it when somebody's actually making statements as part of their question or actually bringing logic into place, because this is a very logical question or questions that he's making. Obviously there's the Calvinist aspect of this question. Do you want to get into that at all, or should we just go right into the biblical interpretation?
We can probably dive right into the thing. No, your particular view of theology will enter into it, like say the listener, because that's one of his issues. He had some pretty large issues, things that just didn't make sense to him with Calvinism, as opposed to what the Bible seemed to be saying. And consequently, that was one of the factors, I think, that he just left Christianity, because the Bible obviously was inadequate. And I think at the time, he embraced Calvinism, the teachings of Calvinism over what the scripture would say. No, I know that I have lots of friends who are Calvinists. They would say, no, it's not over what the scripture says.
That's impossible.
Yeah, no, it's not possible. But we'll talk about that here. I think we need to talk about that in this hour. It's not, Calvinism, Arminianism, preterism, dispensationalism. There's all sorts of different schools of thought amongst Christians on different issues and different sub-issues, like eschatology, for example. So one of the first problems that surfaces, and I experienced this problem personally myself, is that typically most people embrace a particular theology or theory of the Bible, or a theory of what it says. They embrace a particular systematic theology before they have sufficient knowledge of the actual Bible to be able to rationally assess that theology. And then what happens is that for the rest of their lives, typically I see a lot of guys, they'll embrace a systematic theology in their early 20s. And I was there. By the time I was probably 26, I think, roughly, I thought I had a position on everything. I mean, you asked the question, there was an answer. I had a position on that. And I use the word position intentionally here. I'm very nervous about positions now. But I had a position on everything until I had a friend who was very savvy when it comes to what the Bible said. He was educated in the scriptures beyond what I had. And he says, well, why don't you think about these verses for a week, and then let's talk about it in 7 days. And by the time those 7 days rolled around, I had to concede that maybe he's got a point here. Now, this was a point on eschatology, mind you. But what happened is I began teaching the Bible. Well, let me give some backstory here. My mother actually introduced me to this concept of spending daily time reading the Bible when I was 8.5 years old. And she said, I just assumed that's what every 8.5-year-old does. They start reading the Bible. So I started reading the Bible. She says, read it. It doesn't have to be a lot, but read it and then write a little something in your journal here about something that stood out to you. So I started that at age 8.5. So by the time I was 28, I had 20 years worth of Bible reading under my belt, and not just reading it in a semi-conscious state, but reading with the objective of finding something interesting that I could write in my journal. So consequently, I began teaching the Bible in the church I was attending at the time in my mid-20s. And I did that I've done it ever since, actually. So I've taught whole books of the Bible, many books more than once. But what I noticed myself doing, probably in my 30s sometime, was that because I'd already embraced a systematic theology by the time I was, say, 19 years old or 20, I had spent the next 15, 20 years making the Bible fit my theology.
Can you define systematic theology? I've got a really thick book on my bookshelf here called Systematic Theology, but can you explain what that is?
Maybe
let me throw out some ideas.
One sentence. Okay, one sentence would be an understanding of what the Bible says on every aspect of the spiritual life and how those are interrelated. That would be one sentence attempt.
So maybe a framework around
framework is a good
how one understands the Bible. So you've got sort of your statement of faith that drives how you read the Bible.
A statement of faith is usually simpler than a systematic theology. A statement of faith is, you can usually write that down a number of points on a piece of paper, but often a systematic theology, as you just pointed out here, Sheldon, might take a whole book, and even then you've only just done a first pass on it. So it's not just the framework. The framework is essential in systematic theology, but putting the flesh on that framework would also be included, because you want to just you want not only to understand the framework, you want to understand all the details of each aspect of the framework. But the problem is the framework itself and some of the details itself. A lot of that most people embrace just because what they hear, say, preached from the pulpit, or they read a book on systematic theology. And usually the first thing you read on a topic, if you're interested in it, has an enormous amount of influence on shaping your future thinking in that area. So typically, whatever book on systematic theology you read will tend to be what you start your theological framework on. And now what I do now, I encourage young men, and this is controversial.
And women.
Yeah, and women. Although I find that the young guys are the women actually they tend to study the Bible a lot more than the men actually read in my surveys. So the women, no, I'm just doing on my surveys, but there was significantly more women in any age group will read the Bible on a daily basis than men. And so what I found is that the women who read the Bible establish their framework in a way that I actually would recommend. And whereas the men, they want to take shortcuts. So let's get to the point here. Let's just get a book on systematic theology. Let's read that, and then we'll get it all lined up. Now, I know I'm speaking in generalities here, of course, because you'll have men and women on both sides of the thing. But a lot of women will just start reading the Bible, and as they read, what the Bible says will begin to emerge. They'll see what it says, and a theology starts coming together, a framework starts coming together as a result of time and time again, or lots of time spent reading the Bible. Whereas the young guys who are especially fallible in this area will get the framework first from some other book other than the Bible, and then they will make the Bible fit that. So what I'm recommending is what I find the women are more likely to do. I actually think that's a better way to establish your theology. And at this point, I'm not saying I'd like to remove the gender aspect away from it, because I just think there is a better way to study the scriptures, and that is study them and let the scriptures themselves, the Bible themselves, start to build your framework. And immediately you'll see, let's say if you start in the New Testament, the Gospels, you'll see some essential aspects of Christianity get established very quickly and very clearly. So it's not like you'll be wandering in the theological wilderness for years. No, one pass through the New Testament will establish a lot of the primary aspects of authentic Christianity. But watch out here's what happens though, if you read a book and get your framework from the book and then try and make the Bible fit. It's what exactly I was doing. So I would gloss over those passages that don't really fit the systematic theology that I embraced, and or reinterpret them. and we're going to need to talk about this idea of reinterpreting things. So I was teaching the book of Hebrews. I've taught that quite a few times now. The first time I just whizzed through it and glossed over what needed to be glossed over and did a quick interpret on the other stuff. And my class were typically university and CEGEP students in Quebec. And, this book of Hebrews was pretty new to them. And so there were no people challenging my glossing over of things. They didn't catch me. They didn't call me on it. The second time I did it, I was very uncomfortable, and I knew my audience might be a little more picky. So I actually went back to systematic theology and some of the main teachers in that area of the theology that I had embraced to see how do they handle this passage. And it's kind of like studying for an exam. I need to know this because it's not the natural way of what the passage seems to say. It's a little trickier. So tomorrow when I teach this, I need to be able to just kind of interpret it or put it in the light that this famous person here has. And so that's what I was doing. And the third time I said, look, this is disrespect. If I actually believe the Bible is God's revelation to humanity, I'm actually disrespecting the Bible by trying to make it fit some systematic theology I read in the book. So I'll just let it say what it says. And that marked a huge transition in my own understanding of the Bible.
Now, is that not dangerous in a way where all of a sudden you're coming up with doctrines because God's given you you've read something that nobody else in history has ever read, and you've built your own doctrine around? Is that not potentially a problem?
Oh, there's a minefield of problems, Sheldon. You've pegged one of them. So one of the problems is, okay, so let's just read the Bible literally, I got so discouraged with Christian books in general that for about 20 years I read virtually no more Christian books at all. I would just read the Bible over and over and over again. Now, I don't in any way want to disparage Christian books. I might recommend actually one or two in this program here that are especially helpful on this topic. And I've read a lot since then, but for 20 years I just read it and reread it, and it was amazing how some of the difficulties that I had between the Bible and the systematic theology started to fall into place when I put the systematic theology just on the table. It's up for grabs. A lot of it was reaffirmed. Others, there's something new I saw. But anyways, the danger is, how do I know that I've understood a passage correctly? And right off the bat, one of my operating principles is I am not infallible when it comes to understanding what the Bible says. I am not. So I often say, and I just was teaching a week or so ago, a series of seminars for a week, and I said at one point, do not trust a word I say. We were looking at what the Bible said about a topic. I always go back to the Bible to see if what I say is true. See what it actually says, and then you'll know whether I'm telling the truth or not. And that actually is a word that comes right out of the book of Acts, where the Bereans, the people in the city of Berea, when the Apostle Paul came, it says they said they were more noble-minded than all the other people in all the other cities, because the Apostle Paul would be preaching, but they would go back to the scriptures to see if what he's saying is true. And if they did that for the Apostle Paul, who wrote a good chunk of the New Testament, actually it wasn't Paul, it was the Holy Spirit speaking through Paul, then we need to take that seriously ourselves. I mean, when we read some book of systematic theology, whether it's by a contemporary scholar or by a so-called church father, an older scholar who lived centuries ago. So we need to take that seriously. So how do I know? Number one, we need to bounce this off of other people. And that's where I think, home or Bible studies are group times, either on Sunday or some weeknight, get together with a bunch of like-minded people and you study a book of the Bible, and you can run your stuff by other people. And that's a form of accountability. So you're not just dangling out there coming up with wacko interpretations. Hopefully the people there are going to be astute enough to be able to call you on it, or no, maybe not even call you on it. Most of the time it's gracious, and they said, well, did you think about this? Or what about that verse over there? Or how do you fit this with that there? So there's an accountability process where Christians get together and they discuss what they think that passage means. And there, after you've done the study, that's when I will refer sometimes to, let's say, a commentary. So I'd like to know what other people thought about this, but it's after I've done my first very intensive examination and analysis of the passage so that I'm even in a position to start to evaluate what other people say.
Okay, I'm going to throw a passage out to you, and you'll probably catch what I'm trying to do pretty quick here.
Oh, no.
But I want to make a point. To you I will give all this authority and their glory, for it has been delivered to me, and I give it to whom I will. If you then will worship me, it will all be yours.
Yeah. Okay.
So the reason I'm pulling it, I saw this on social media, and it was actually a verse of the day.
Wow.
on not just on a website, but on a like, it had a little flower on it, and it was just this beautiful.
No. Oh, no.
So the person built a meme out of it, but it said, "This is all great until you realize who said it."
Yeah, until you realize you said it.
So let's talk about context.
Oh yeah, of course.
Because when Satan says something to Jesus, you don't want to take Satan's word and build a verse of the day around it without the context.
Absolutely, that should not become your verse of the day. And the beauty, now this is another, but what you've raised here, Sheldon, is another challenge in why does the Bible seem confusing sometimes, and that is that because it can be Satan himself in the temptation of Jesus. There's three major temptations discussed in that passage and the similar ones in the other gospels. Three major temptations, and in those temptations he actually quoted the Bible. And so the Bible itself can be misused, in this case by none other than Satan himself, to get you to do things that you ought not to do. And so that's the first thing. We need to know.
I pulled this back up because I think that is actually one of the answers to this question of why is it so easy to misunderstand and misinterpret? Well, there's a battle going on where you have one side that wants to confuse things.
Yeah.
And if you're listening to that, you're going to get confused.
Yeah, and the thing is, well, Satan, the word Satan is from the Hebrew word Satan, which is which is basically the prosecutor in a court of law. So the prosecutor's job is to bring your infractions and put them right out there and make sure you pay. That's one of the meanings of the word Satan. So, but he's also referred to as the father of lies. Don't ever forget that. The father of lies. So we don't actually know what Satan's name was when he was first created, because when he was first created, he was flawless. We're told in Ezekiel chapter 28, flawless and probably the most powerful of all angels. He was referred to, his title was chief of the cherubim, and the cherubim were certain angelic creatures that don't look at all human, very powerful, and he was chief of those. But then he became so impressed with his abilities that he says his understanding was corrupted. His ability to reason and think was corrupted, to become perverted and twisted. And in that state which he is now in, he is now referred to as the father of lies. So we have, if you're going to take the Bible seriously, you have to take seriously what it says. And the Satan is not just some mythical creature that we just laugh about. He is much, much more evident in developing countries where it's advantageous for Satan to make himself evident, to create a fear factor. Here, it's much more advantageous that Satan convinces the population that he doesn't even exist. And when you believe the enemy does not even exist, it frees that enemy right up to completely infiltrate your castle, your ranks, your midst, and then you're at his mercy. And how does he infiltrate? Because, well, one of the ways is he's the father of deception, of lies. And so there is an enormous amount of deception floating around right now with even what the Bible says. So you might think, well, wow, like we're totally at the mercy now. How are we ever going to figure out what's going on? But here's a couple of pointers. Number one is that if God decided to use human language to communicate with us, as he does in the Bible, then we ought to use the rules of human language to understand what he's saying. In other words, it would be odd if God used human words to communicate with us, but never used the rules of human language, that human language to communicate. That would be very bizarre. Nevertheless, some people take that approach. So I met with a guy at the University of Manitoba, a student leader in one of the other clubs, and he said, what the Bible appears to say is the last thing you should ever think it's saying. It's you can rule that right off the top. The Bible, he said, never means what it appears to say. You have to have a special meaning, and that will vary from person to person. Well, that, I would say, is straight out of the playbook of the father of lies. That removes all rules of human language. It completely leaves us in limbo land, in this gray zone where you could never know anything, and totally up to your imagination what you wanted to say. And so we're not free to interpret the Bible any way we want. We have to use the rules of human language. So when people ask me, well, how do you interpret the Bible? I say, in the same way I interpret any other book, whether it's a physics textbook, whether it's a fiction, a work of fiction, a good work of fiction, whether it's just a history book, whether it's you name it. We write books in languages using the rules of those language. And when the Bible comes along, we need to use those same rules of human language. Then that really eliminates a pile of just nonsense that's out there, just total nonsense, and massively confuses humanity. That's one rule. Use the same rule of interpretation that you would use for any other book written in your language.
So an example would be if you're reading Psalms, and it's a very poetic way of writing, you don't read it so that it's 100% literal, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a poetry aspect of it. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, when it says something, you don't say, oh, it obviously means the opposite.
No, no, you're absolutely right. In fact, I took a seminary course on biblical interpretation. I think, well, basically, it was like a review of English literature because the course was in English, although later on when I took a double course in Greek, the same rules applied. But the basic bottom line is that, yes, there are rules of language such that if you're reading a poem, you almost expect that there's going to be figures of speech used there. And surprisingly, the figures of speech, most of the figures of speech you will study, and I'm assuming it'll be in English since this is an English podcast or live stream. Most of if not all of them, you'll find used in the Bible. So it's just the same rules of language. And if it's used in the Bible, those same figures of speech also appear in Greek as well as in Hebrew and Aramaic. So these figures of speech are not just something English people invented. They've been around for thousands of years in many languages. And there's rules as to when you bring those figures of speech into play and when they're not. And you'll learn these rules even in a secular literature course. Purely secular literature course will give you enough knowledge on figures of speech so that when you come to the Bible, using those same rules, you'll be able to say, okay, this should be taken at face value. This here is a figure of speech. It's like something or as something, well, then you know that's a simile, and so forth.
So when you think of these different ways of reading based on the type of literature it is, do you see I'll throw Revelation out because that's one that's always used as, well, this isn't literal. This is just symbolism. Mm-hmm. But then when you actually look into it, it's like, well, but it seems to be a little bit more than symbolism here.
Yeah, it's not an either or case.
So at some point, you have to take meaning out of what the words are saying. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where a lot of people get confused is, I don't know what this means because it's not literally written out exactly what it's supposed to mean. Therefore, I need to go and see what other people have said it means. And now all of a sudden you're going to a framework to, whether it's a commentary or part of Calvinism or Arminianism, whatever it is, that you're now having to interpret the Bible based on what other people have said about it. Now, is that wrong?
No, it's not wrong. It's tricky. And so the tricky bit here is, in general, one of the rules that I live by is the Bible interprets itself, but the words that are translated in another language, you are going to have to depend upon what the scholars who study original manuscripts determine that word to mean. So it's not, basically the idea here is that if God wrote the Bible for all the people all over the world, then you don't need to be an advanced scholar. He did not limit access to what understanding his word to just the elite, to just the scholars, just those that are up to date on the latest new hermeneutical approaches. No, he wrote the scriptures so that anybody all over the world in their own language reading this or hearing it or listening to it could come to an accurate understanding of what it's trying to say, at least on all the major important aspects of what we call the framework of your systematic theology. But the problem is you've got to read or hear it in your language, and that has to be translated from the original manuscripts or the original languages, not original manuscripts. We don't have original manuscripts. We've got ancient manuscripts that date very close to the originals in some cases. But we need to translate it from the original languages, which are Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. And fortunately, an enormous amount of literature or scholarship has gone into this, not just in Christian circles, but in the secular academic world. And the secular academic world doesn't necessarily have a particular systematic theology they want to support. So they're just looking at it often more objectively than sometimes maybe an academic scholar might, who's a Christian. Now I need to say, in fairness to the academic Christian scholars, I find that they're probably at least as objective, just as objective as the secular world, and in some cases, maybe more so. So it's for New Testament, for example, let's take that. So you have a bunch of books of the New Testament, all written in Greek, first century Greek. We might call that Koine Greek. So what do those words mean when you're doing a translation? And by the way, the Bible is not a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy. You know, we didn't translate the New American Standard Version 2020 edition from the 1995 edition, which was translated from the 1972 edition. We didn't do that. Each time, a good peer-reviewed translation is translated right from ancient manuscripts, hopping over thousands of years of biblical history, but from ancient manuscripts. And some of our best New Testament manuscripts for the whole New Testament, Codex Vaticanus, Sinaiticus, and Alexandrius, are all 4th and 5th century texts, dating from 325 AD to maybe 425 AD, roughly. So the question is, what do these words mean in modern English? And so fortunately, there's a lot of other first century writings circulating around out there as well. So the scholars, they're not just limited to how was the word used in the Bible. They also can look at how it was used elsewhere at the same time to get what did this word mean when they was said to the first century people who understood Koine Greek at the time. Now, there's an excellent lexicon I would recommend, and that is, well, it's the short form is BDAG, BDAG. It's Bauer, Danker, Arndt, and Gingrich's lexicon, analytical lexicon, or lexicon of the New Testament, or the Greek. I can't remember. I use it all the time. I've used it for years, and I just refer to it as BDAG, BDAG. Just Google that. Now, to use these lexicons, the best lexicon, and I say this is the best one for Greek. Why is that? Because even in Greek, there's a difference between ancient Greek, say the time of Plato and Socrates, what those words meant, and what they meant in the first century, some 400 years later. And it's the same with, say, the King James Version and the New American Standard 2020 version. you can read the King James Version was actually a pretty good translation in 1611. And I grew up on that, so I understand it fluently. But what I did not realize until I started looking at the Greek was that, whoa, like these English words, which I thought I understood, the English words have evolved. And so they have a different meaning today than they did in the 1600s. So I'm reading the King James Version thinking I understand it perfectly, no problem. I'm fine with all of these and thys. When in reality, what I'm getting out of that is not actually what the Greek manuscript said. Even the Greek manuscript that the King James Version was translated from, the Textus Receptus. So that's why I think some of these, I've got way off point here. Bottom line is this, is that we can be pretty confident most of the time that the words that we see translated in our English translation are accurate translations of what was there originally. But a lot of times it's still helpful to look up the lexicon, because you'll see 2 or 3 nuances of that word. And sometimes it's just not possible. There is no English word. And so you have to use, maybe you'll see in the New American Standard 2020 edition, you'll see words in italics. What that means is that those italicized words are not actually in the original Greek. But the original Greek was saying something that this is the best way you can translate it to English. So you've got these 1 or 2 extra words here. They put it in, but just so you know, it's italicized. But I think,
and that's really important, because if you think that the translators are sitting at a table going word by word, just going, okay, this is what the Greek word is. Okay, let's put the English word down. You don't know how translations work. It's really about meaning, and yes, the words are important, but the meaning is more important. So they may have to tweak things to make it work, and that's often where when Corey's talking about contradictory and confusing text, sometimes some of those things that seem like contradictions aren't contradictions. It's just that's a translation problem where we don't exactly know what some of the things were in the original text.
That raises another problem. It could be due to that, or it could be due to that Western mentality that we have in the 21st century. So there's an excellent, let's say, what's his name? Blomberg. Craig Blomberg has written a number of books, but one of them has to do with New Testament documents. But one of the things he points out in one of his chapters is that we in the 21st century in Western culture tend to make certain assumptions when we're reading documents from the ancient Near East that were not in place in the ancient Near East. For example, if I quote somebody in the 21st century, that quote has to be word for word, letter for letter, identical to what the guy who I'm quoting said. That's our 21st century expectation. Not so in ancient Near East literature. What was important is that what the idea, what the point was that the guy was getting across, that is vital to communicate. The exact wording is flexible. So when we read, say, some quotes in the New Testament from the Old, you go back to the Old and say, wow, and there's no word for word quoting going here. What's going on? A little sloppy, if you ask me. No, that's not at all required. What's required is that the idea is accurately transferred. Another Western mentality mistake we make that appears to produce contradictions, but it shouldn't be, it's just an assumption, is that if, let's say if I'm giving a narrative, I'm giving recounting what I saw when I went to town this afternoon. And so I write it out and then I give it to somebody. And then later on, they find out that something else happened in town that I didn't mention. Well, they might think I'm being a little dishonest here, that I've left out something here that actually happened in town.
You didn't tell the whole truth.
That's right. There was what's this? Was this missing? Or maybe I'm talking to a group of people in town, and I'm having a conversation with the group, and there's one person in the group who's sort of acting as the spokesperson, and then I get their decision, or I get the point they're making, and then I come home and I say to one person, oh, this group here said, there was a group of guys that said this, but I'm talking to another person and I say, Joe, who was the spokesperson, Joe said this. So then later on, somebody's looking at the two accounts and say, oh, a contradiction here. Here, it was a group of people. Here, it's only one person. It's the same point, but it's a contradiction. But no, in ancient Near East cases, in both of those examples I gave, it was only the important bits of the narrative that would be communicated. The stuff that the writer wasn't really important for his point was not just simply not mentioned. But another writer might come along and they might think that thing is important for some particular point they want to make. And then there's the case of the angels at the tomb. In one thing, it's there's two angels at the tomb, and they say such and such. Another gospel is this that only mentions one angel who says such and such. So what's going on here? Was there one angel at the tomb or two? Well, our Western mentality, we're saying, okay, here's a contradiction, not with the ancient Near East. Ancient Near East would just assume, okay, there were two angels at the tomb and one was doing the talking. And this is what the one doing the talking said. But another person will report it as this is what the two angels said, because the one doing the talking represents what both angels do.
And so I think some of it is also the author. When you have a doctor writing compared to a fisherman, like you're going to have a little bit different detail or even just why the person's writing. It often will adjust what is highlighted. Or
absolutely. In fact, you see that in the four Gospels. So, for example, Matthew and Mark. Basically, in the ancient Near East, when you did, and this is what Craig Blomberg brings out again, when you're giving an historical narrative, this is stuff that happened, and you're telling what happened. There was no expectation that you would be telling it in the order that it happened. There was no expectation at all. You're just giving the person this is what happened, and you give a number of things that happened, but the order was not important. The only time you could assume the order is included, or is you're getting it in the order that the events happened, is if it's explicitly stated that. So when Luke writes his gospel, he actually states that he's writing it in the order that it happened, these events. Whereas if you look at Matthew or Mark, you'll find that a lot of times those events do not occur in the same order of each other, or more in the case of Luke. So there's another expectation that we make, that we say, oh, look at, here's how the events unfolded in this gospel, but look how they contradict the order of how they unfolded in that one over there. There is no contradiction. It's only a contradiction produced by your own Western mentality and failing to understand what the ancient Near East point was when they're telling an historical narrative. The point was, get all the important events out there. Order doesn't matter, but the events do. And then there'll be some point to carry away, our series of lessons.
Okay, so last part of Corey's message on this one was, can you base your faith off it, especially when understanding the Bible is so important for one's faith, which is a determinant of salvation or damnation? So my question is, when you've got so many different opinions or frameworks that have come out over 2,000 years plus of people that have read the Bible, you've got all these different denominations. You've got the Catholics versus the Protestants. You've got a lot of cults that have come out where they'll pick a verse and say, okay, this is the most important thing in the world. We're going to build our religion around it. You've got the KKK that uses the Bible to back up what they say. You've got people all over that use the Bible to just back up what they want, some policy or politics or whatever it is. How can we look at this book and say, you know what, I'm going to die for this thing? Mm-hmm. It is that important.
Yeah, excellent question. What I always tell people who are beginning to study the Bible, want to teach them, is that there's a particular way of studying the scriptures that I would call inductive Bible study. And it would have a minimum of 3 components: observation, interpretation, and application. Now, you can add more components to that if you want, but observation is the most important part of any study of the Bible. And observation just means read the passage and take a piece of paper and answer some very basic questions. And it would be the kind of observations that a police officer might make at the scene of a crime. Police officers not trying to jump to conclusions, not coming up with theories. The first thing they do is write down all the facts, and that's basically it, just the facts. So you would ask yourself questions as who is mentioned in this passage? Is there a time mentioned? Is there some sort of time frame mentioned in this passage? Where does this occur? What words are being used here? Are any words repeated? It's just a careful observation. And so when I'm asked to speak on a particular passage, let's say a couple of weeks in advance, somebody might say, "Hey, could you do a talk on some passage in the Bible?" I will spend most of my time reading that passage over and over and over again, just making observations. And your first pass, I mean, if you just read it over once, that's rather inadequate. Let's put it that way. You need to read it over and over again because you'll miss observations. Once you've got that done, then you can start moving into interpretation. And the interpretation answers the question, well, what did this mean to the people that received this letter, or that the author was speaking to? What did this mean to them? This is where you might want to do some correlation with other passages in the Bible to see if other passages talk about the same thing, which might shed light on what you're reading. And there's a ton of that. It's why I read the Bible over like roughly every 8 to 9 months, is I just want a thorough background knowledge of what the Bible says on everything and everywhere, so that I'm much better positioned to do a correlation, to see things, oh, this correlates with that. And I see correlations now. Let's see, I'm literally 60 years almost since I started studying the Bible for my own. I see new correlations all the time. So you'll never run out of that. And then finally, interpretation. And that is, well, not interpretation, it's application. What does this mean for me? What am I supposed to do about this? Now, interpretation is tricky. So there are mistakes not to make. And I don't have time to cover all of them, but there's 3 major categories of mistakes. One would be word study fallacies. That is, coming up with a meaning for a word that's not really legit for that passage there. The second, and there's quite a few of these. Then there was another set of fallacies called grammatical fallacies. That's where you start messing with the rules of language to make it say what you want to say. And so there's a passage on that. And then there's a third category called what is it? Logical fallacies. Logical fallacies, which you can get from any philosophy program. And there's an excellent book that I want to recommend on this topic. It's by D.A. Carson, and it's called Exegetical Fallacies. And he'll look at all three. He looks at all 3 categories and a whole ton of different examples or different types under each category. So it's inductive Bible study coupled with a real sensitivity to committing fallacies. And most of the fallacies start getting committed when you want to make it fit what you want it to say, either because you want to make it fit your systematic theology, or probably even more common today is you want to make the Bible fit your culture. You want to make it culturally acceptable. And so what it says, for example, in sexuality, you want to reinterpret those passages so that it's acceptable to culture. And so culture then becomes the mold within which the Bible must fit. And to do that, we will have to commit fallacies of either logic, grammatical fallacies, or word study fallacies, or even just in general, blatant cherry picking and glossing over.
I had to find this on my computer. I'll see if I can dig up where I got it from. But there's a computer visualizer person that did some analytics on the Bible, and this is the reason I bring this up is the Bible works together really well. Mm-hmm. And if you're saying, oh, there's all these contradictions, you're not reading it properly. But it works.
Probably not even reading it
at all.
At all. I mean,
or you're just reading somebody's article that they wrote on some atheist website. But
I've seen a printout. A guy handed me a printout of hundreds of contradictions. computer printout, and I looked like this. And so I started, oh, this should be interesting. I started looking through it, and wow, it looked like some guys had sat around a fireplace one evening having beers. And hey, let's just flip through here and come up with contradictions, because man, if they'd only read the next verse in a lot of those things, or they only read the context, or they were familiar with what the other chapter had to say about this. What I did is I just don't take my word about the contradiction aspect of things. What I did when I was 17, I think I started when I was 16, is I took the Bible and a notebook, and I'd heard rumors that this filled with contradictions. And I thought, wow, like I haven't noticed these yet. I better find them. So I started with Genesis and read through to Revelation, writing down all the contradictions that I could find, every one of them. First of all, there weren't a whole lot, but there were some. And what I found often was that I'd write a contradiction down, but then later on when I'm reading, let's say, for example, there's passages in the Bible that cover the same event from different angles. Oh, well, okay, then that contradiction disappears, and this one disappears. And by the time I was done, and this was only my first pass, I only had about two or three. Now, since then, I've added to that list and I've taken them away. But no, if somebody says the Bible is full of contradictions, the first thing you better do is, well, how many times you've read it through from cover to cover with a notebook taking notes, because they just don't fly.
I hope this comes through okay on high definition. It's a lot better on 4K, but this little graph, I don't know if you've seen this before, Kirk, but basically it is each of the white bars at the bottom is a chapter and how long it is. So Psalm 119 is in the middle here, and so you can see all the different chapters in the Bible and the different it alternates color based on what book it's in, but the colors and the arcs are where a chapter references another verse from another chapter. So you think of your cross references in the Bible. This is a visualization of what that looks like. And when you have so many references between different books, between different authors, etc., and you can barely find anything to say, oh, this is a really, really important contradiction. Because even if you find a contradiction, it really probably isn't that important. It's just the way somebody wrote something.
Yeah. In fact, I find that this graphic even is simpler than reality. In reality, what I find is that it's more of a three-dimensional lattice work. So everything that you'll see in the Bible is connected to other things that go deeper or over here, or up here. So you could actually do that same graph in a 3D, and it'd be even more impressive.
Yeah. This is just awesome for my this on my computer background for a long time, and it's like it blows my mind every time I look at it, because
and it also illustrates something else amazing about the Bible. Number one is if you count the book of Job, which some scholars believe was written around the time of Abraham, or roughly 2000 BC. If not, then you start with say Moses at 1400 BC or whatever. You have a book that was written over a period of 2000 years that is by a ton of different authors, that is incredibly interlaced and consistent. It's I've never seen anything like it. And I have read, I guess it's thousands of books, literally, because I was a book fanatic and still am.
And none of the human authors knew what they were actually doing when they wrote those books. It wasn't like, oh, this is going to be in the Bible someday.
Yeah. No, they didn't know that. And they didn't, a lot of times they might be writing one section without even being aware of other things. And so it was just, they were creating one brick in a building that when you stood far away and say, hey, that brick makes an entire building here. So that's an amazing, and the other thing is, when you looked at that cross-referencing graphic that you put up there, is the interesting thing is that if we wrote a book, you would have everything to do with, let's say, what are the final days of humanity? That would be one book or one chapter. What about angels? There's another chapter. And so in a textbook, you can typically go to the table of contents. What are you interested in? Oh, I'm interested in angels. Okay, that will be this right here. That's not at all the way the Bible is written. It's written in such a way such that, let's say, if you were to randomly rip out 1/3 of it, just any 1/3, and throw it away, the remaining 2/3, chances are, would still be talking about all the essential aspects of doctrine that you need. Now, of course, if you ripped out the entire New Testament, you'd be ripping out maybe what I would call the heart, the actual culmination of what all the Old Testament points to. So there would be some limitations on that. But let's say you deleted 1/3 of the New Testament randomly and deleted 1/3 of the Old Testament randomly, you would still have probably all the essential aspects of authentic Christianity still there, because it's spread out everywhere and it's interlaced everywhere and it correlates with so many other things. And this is one of the reasons I think the Bible has the fingerprint of a supernatural designer or author that presided over the whole process.
Yeah. Obviously, this was created by the laws of physics at the beginning of the origin of the universe.
Well, no, that would be a problem, because if that was the case, we wouldn't even have language.
Anyways, well, good conversation. We got to go because you have some stuff going on, but we won't be around next week. I think a couple weeks from now we'll be back, and I think I'm there. I'm here for that, and then. Yeah, so if you have an idea for our next conversation, dump it in the comments. If you have any questions, any complaints, throw that in the comments, in the chat, or the comments on the video, or go to kirkdurston.com and leave a message there. He would love to have a conversation with you. And as you can see from our message with Corey, we do get good ideas out of what people have said to us in the comments. So, all right, we will talk to you later.
Bye for now.